Why do you why do you think Secret Lives took everybody by wind? Because it's not the perfect picture of life. Like these
Mm-hmm.
girls struggle in their individual way. Yes, whatever the title, whatever, scratch all that.
Mm-hmm.
There's someone out there that is Taylor Frankie Paul in a different state, in a different world, in a
Yep.
different atmosphere. And she's struggling the same freaking way. And she's Mormon.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Christ Pearls channel. This is Jessica, and today I have a few friends here. We're going to have a discussion about who do we trust and why do we trust them. So, first of all, I have my friend Mama Sosa here, and she is going to be a female perspective. Mama, do you want to tell us about
Of
yourself?
course. Hey guys, it's Mama Sosa. I'm here with the lovely Christ Pearls. I'm very excited to do this and to be part of this segment because I think it's really exciting and to really get a different perspective of everybody and having different backgrounds.
Thank you. And where can we find you? Tell us where we can find you.
You guys can find me at Espino Sosa, Espino.Sosa on Instagram and on TikTok. And I am about to start my YouTube channel pretty soon and do a podcast. So stay tuned.
Okay, that's awesome. Okay, perfect. Yeah, let me know when that drops. And then I also have my friend Scott here. He is over on the Nursery Leaders Unite channel. Scott, do you want to give us a little intro? Tell us about yourself.
Yeah, I do News for Leaders Unite, and I also have another one that's Seminary Dropouts Unite, where I'm a little more wild on the content. But I like to explore LDS thought and share some ideas. So I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming, you guys. I really appreciate you guys taking your Saturday to spend it with me over here talking about the gospel. I'm sure there's plenty of other fun things you could be doing, so thank you. And then we also have possibly Latter-day Lion joining us later. He's running a little behind, but if he's able to join in the discussion, he'll come on later and I'll introduce him. But there's a topic that we've been kind of talking about privately behind the scenes, just observing some of the cultural things that we have going on in the world and also in the church. And as you know, a lot of times what's happening in the world has an effect on what's happening in the church. So we decided we wanted to talk a little bit about this concept of trust. As members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we're taught to trust in the Lord with all our heart. But we're also taught to trust in the leaders that God calls and that Jesus Christ calls to be his appointed servants. This includes prophets, apostles, and those with priesthood keys who serve in the ecclesiastical structure of the church. But how do we gain that trust? What happens when questions arise about church history, for example, or a doctrine in the church, or even decisions from living prophets that we may or may not understand or agree with? How do we discern what is of God and what is not? Do you guys have any thoughts on that? How do you discern?
All right. So, how I discern on what the leaders of the church and you can say the prophet or any type of leader of the official church was to speak about, even our bishopric or any type of leader, period, I use my spiritual witness. I think it's very important to pray about the things that you can say questioning. You have the right to question. I think that we forget that we have a right as members of the church to push back on a thought or put a thought on something that has been said. I think that's very important. You have the right to do that. And I think that what makes us different from a lot of other denominations in the structure of our church. It's just more of a spiritual witness, just praying about it. That's the what I would do.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's important, right? Because, I mean, President Nelson, he's been saying that it will not be possible to survive spiritually without the guiding, directing, comforting hand of the Holy Ghost, right? And that quote that he gave in conference, that's been quoted by many, many people, general authorities in the church, other apostles. So I think that there's something important about that and utilizing that gift of the Holy Ghost. I like that idea. What do you think, Scott? What do you think about discernment? How do you discern?
So one extra layer that I like to add to that is probably starting with Joseph Smith, where he talks about understanding the nature of God and how if you understand the nature of God, you can understand how things that you run into, experiences that you have, align or don't align with your understanding of the nature of God. For example, him as a father instead of just like the creator is a different layer to that understanding. And as I've run into different ideas, that has helped me tremendously through reading a lot of scripture and understanding the different big ideas, not necessarily, the definition of a word, but the big concepts of how revelation works, how God's experience with his children works. And I have examples where people have come to me and said, "Hey, I ran into something new. This is a really cool idea. I think it's from God," and they'll tell it to me, and I'll say, "Okay, well, maybe, but as of right now, that kind of grinds against some of the other things that I've seen, big picture, and so I don't feel like I need to like jump on that and get excited. I'm going to be more patient with it, and it really helps kind of filter out some of the things that don't fit as well with my understanding of who God is."
Yeah, I like that too. I think that's really important. So let me really quickly just introduce our friend Latter-day Lion here. He's, always late, but we forgive him. This is like
That's
literally
rude.
every time. But we love what he has to say. So let's introduce. So Monty, do you want to give a little intro? Tell us where we can find you, and we'll get you up to speed here.
Yeah, no, and I do apologize for being late. As you guys can probably tell, I am not in my studio. But yeah, I am Monty the Latter-day Lion. You can find me on TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, though I'm not as active on there as well, and on X, all under the Latter-day Lion. I like being able to join these things, offer my 2 cents, and just having some really good conversations with folks. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, you know what? We're just happy to have you. However, we can have you. You always have some really fun thoughts to share, and you've got some hard hitting remarks that I always love. So, give us some more on this topic. So, what helps you decide who or what to trust when it comes to your spiritual guidance?
The probably my favorite scripture within the Book of Mormon is actually 2 Nephi 28 through 29, and I love being able to learn about things, but I want to be very careful not to fall into the trap of credentialism and falling so much on relying on people who like may have the degrees and things like that, but mainly relying on the Lord, and going to Him, because there's really no other way to recognize that. And there's also the aspects of the fruits of the Spirit, which may not necessarily be always apparent right out, I feel. But the important aspects, I think, is just to recognize. I mean, there was a devotional from Elder Bednar, I think in 2009, that he gave to the MT, where a lot of the times we may question ourselves as to whether or not something is or is not from the Spirit. But he's like, you know what? Just be a good boy, be a good girl, and the Lord will lead you right.
Actually, I have to chime in on this because, and just kind of add a second witness. I can't even tell you guys how long and hard the road of learning to be obedient has been for me. Like, it's taken a very, very long time. And I wasn't very good at it as a teenager. I wasn't very good at it as a young adult. I was a single mom for a long time. I think I struggled on and off, even as a parent, trying to live the gospel. But there's one principle that I've come to know, and it is that obedience is tied to sacrifice. These are connected. And it's really difficult to have confidence in whatever voice you're hearing or feeling, no matter where it's coming from, if you're not being obedient. Like, there's definitely a connection between that and the ability to discern truth from error. That's my opinion. It's been my experience. Do you guys have any thoughts on that? Let's see. Sosa, do you want to say anything about that? Like, how do you feel about the connection between obedience and discernment, for example?
I think sometimes obedience is not what we want to do. It's what the Lord knows what's best for us. And I've always said this, like, so with my prior background and what I used to do for a living, I used to work at a nightclub. The money's great. It's awesome. I made tons of money, and remind you, I was an active member and at the same time a bottle girl. And the hardest thing for me was the income to leave. It wasn't the actual industry, leave the industry was the income. But and not to mention too, I had all the lavish things, my bills were paid. But then I also started realizing like the environment that I was in and how it didn't allow me to be obedient and have a clean schedule and a clean environment and have a clean spirit. And I think obedience is more internal, and how you view things is not just like, oh, well, since God put these commandments and they're rules. No, they're boundaries. They're boundaries for you to not suffer internally because I was suffering internally without knowing, thinking that, okay, well, my bills are paid, I'm good to go. Now that I live more at my means, I'm more happy and have more peace because we think, oh, our bills are paid, we got peace. But also, I was more in shackles and hell in the industry that I was at. So, because I listened to the obedience and understanding the laws and commandments and submitting to those, it it implemented peace in my life. I hope that made sense. The way that I
Yeah, that actually does make a lot of sense. And to be honest with you, I had a very similar experience, not so much with my career, but it had a lot to do with the people that I chose to be around. So I didn't grow up with a lot of Latter-day Saints when I was really young. I found some when I was older as a single adult, like attending a singles ward, and I was able to make more friends that way. But just my family, my friends, like who I was growing up around, I felt pulled in a lot of different directions, like you just described. And there was a point in my 20s where I I just was struggling to live the gospel. I was struggling to understand how to discern, how to, I guess, receive revelation. And I did have to make a choice, like what you said. It's like, you kind of have to say, okay, what am I seeking? And then how can I create, I don't know, like the environment and like facilitate what I'm seeking, if that makes sense. Because
I think obedience as well has a lot of self accountability because I was being self accountable of my actions. Like, okay, like I want these things. I want peace. I want happiness. But it comes with obedience and understanding. And it starts with yourself. If and obedience is a lot of discipline. People never talk about that. It's a lot of discipline, a lot of accountability, a lot of self-reflection. Hmm.
Well, I think it makes me think of when Nephi was talking about like putting off the natural man, right? Because that's essentially what you have to do. It's like you're constantly, it is a self-reflection because the natural man, nobody knows what the natural man inside of you is feeling but you. So it is about you. You have to be accountable. And I like this because you guys, this actually ties into a story that I want to share. But before I share it, Scott, do you have anything to add to that?
So I remember a talk that I came across. I'm pretty sure it was Kimball in October of 1954, where he talks about obedience born of faith in God, and is specifically talking about the concept of blind obedience and how there's really no such thing as blind obedience the way people characterize and poke fun at it like we're all just blindly following a prophet or something like that. But it is interesting that you can have different motives for your obedience. You can obey for different reasons, and there are better reasons to obey, and there are really bad reasons to obey. It's one of the things that to me connects to that really well is you'll find people that grow up in the church that are kind of like faithful, but they're just kind of doing the thing they've always done, and then something happens, something traumatic, and maybe they leave the church for a few years or whatever, and they come back, and now their faith is really strong. Now they have this crazy strong testimony and desire to follow and do after having these terrible experiences. Well, why is that? Is it because of the trial? Well, it's because their motivation has changed. The reason why they're doing it has changed because of something that has awakened them to a new reason for their faith.
Yeah, that even kind of touches me a little bit emotionally because I feel like I relate to what you just said. And that is how I feel like, because I've had those times where I've like, I wouldn't say fallen away from the church because I never left the church, but I think in my heart, there were times where I was just like, I don't know if I can do this. And this was a struggle, and obedience was a really big part of this for me because I had difficulty feeling like I could be obedient, and it does affect how you discern, it does affect who you listen to. And I have a story that I just want to summarize really quickly that I think can kind of move us into the next part of this discussion. So we're going to touch on a few things. I'd like to touch on prophets and apostles, how we decide, what counsel we're following and whether or not we trust them, but also scholars because their scholarship plays a huge role in this today, I think. And I'm hoping that maybe you guys can kind of think about that and have that in the back of your mind right now as I share this story. So to kind of move us into that realm, there's a story in church history that is probably a lesser known story, but I feel is really important to this topic. And this was with the Apostle Orson F. Whitney. where for about 20 years of his life, he was embracing a false doctrine and even a false prophet. And this is very interesting because by I think it was '06, Orson F. Whitney became an apostle of the church. But before he could be ordained an apostle, he had to work through this doctrine that he'd embraced. And there's a beautiful story here that I think teaches a little bit about the patience of our prophets and apostles that they have with us, the patience that God has with us, and also that immense potential that we have, even if there's a certain point in time where we might be misunderstanding the gospel or maybe embracing a false doctrine or listening to a false prophet. And there are many, many out there. So we'll kind of get into that. And I hope this will illustrate that. So this like cautionary tale that I'd like to share, to me, it kind of helps me understand how even faithful members of the church can get deceived or be drawn into believing a false doctrine. So in the late 1800s, a returned missionary named Charles W. Stainer began teaching that he was a prophet, the one mighty and strong mentioned in scripture. I guess today you'd probably hear people say the Davidic servant. And he believed that he needed to become the prophet of the church to be able to fulfill his role that he believed he was called to. So he claimed to receive visions. He declared himself a reincarnation of biblical prophets. And then he started like quietly gathering followers among missionaries in the church that he had access to. This included a very young Orson F. Whitney. He was in his early 20s. Whitney later became an apostle. So when he was young, he was like really spiritually curious. He loved talking about deep gospel doctrines. He would explore the like esoteric realms of the gospel, what you might consider like scholarship today. And he would get really deep into that, like the theoretical gospel. And he started embracing a doctrine that's rooted in reincarnation, that it's the multiple mortal probations idea, that he believed that he may have lived multiple lives and had been some of these ancient prophets and apostles and people mentioned in scripture in the Book of Mormon. Like he had this secret prayer group going that Charles Stainer was involved in. And many members believed that they lived as figures like Noah, Nephi, Esther, Benjamin. They would fast, they would share revelations with each other, and then they would also try to promote Charles Stainer to the apostleship. Like they would reach out to the apostles and be like, this guy, he needs to be an apostle. And this included Whitney. But church leaders, they gave a response, and it wasn't in the affirmative. So President Wilford Woodruff and George Q. Cannon, they actually publicly denounced reincarnation as, quote, foolish and nonsensical and false. And even though they did that, Whitney still privately held on to these beliefs for years. He submitted a letter to President Joseph F. Smith, who he was trying to defend this doctrine from scripture, like argue it scripturally, the same way you see scholars arguing opinions today. And he was trying to say, no, I see this in the scriptures. This is doctrine. Well, President Smith kindly listened, but he rejected the theory and he called it fundamentally opposed to the restored truth. Well, in the year, it's about 1900, and he finally repents. So in a humble letter that he wrote, he said, quote, I have been mistaken, honestly mistaken. I no longer believe as I did, unquote. Well, this act of submission marked a turning point for him. He actually went through a really dark time in his life. There's a whole backstory here that's really beautiful. I'm going to skip over that. But the backstory shows how this doctrine led him down a dark road. And to make a long story short, in 1906, Whitney was called as an apostle, and then he publicly declared for the church, quote, the theory of reincarnation is repudiated by this church. Each shall receive his own body made immortal, unquote. And this conclusion mattered a lot to the church because people needed to know that he was no longer embracing this doctrine if he was going to be a special witness and be part of the apostles. And I think that one of the lessons that I learned from this story is how easy it is to listen to yourself and others and not listen to the prophets. For 20 years, he was embracing this doctrine. And the way that he concluded in the end was that he realized that if he was opposed, like if he was in opposition to what the apostles and the first presidency were teaching over and over and over again and had denounced over and over and over again, there was a certain point in time where he realized that he was the one that was in the wrong. And the point that I'd like to illustrate here too is he never went out and publicly taught this doctrine like Charles Stainer did. And this was a key difference because Charles Stainer, he was out publicly teaching this doctrine. He had gotten reprimanded by the church, went through what we would call like a formal disciplinary council today. He was never excommunicated, but he continued to gather people and do these like secret prayer groups and meetings throughout the course of his life until he died. And he was always kind of like walking that fine line of staying in the church or leaving the church. He believed, though, that the prophets and the apostles had keys, and he stayed in the church. Whitney, on the other hand, he didn't teach these things publicly. He was meeting in private. He was like thinking about these things privately, writing to the apostles privately. And this, to me, illustrated a form of obedience of what it means to follow the prophet that I don't know I had thought as deeply about until I had studied this story more in depth. So the thing that's interesting here too is this doctrine that Whitney was embracing is what has spawned the like Denver snuffer doctrines and the things that we're dealing with today. So things that are happening right now go all the way back to this point in time in the late 1800s. Having that context and maybe something in church history to consider, I don't know, what are your guys' thoughts on that? Like, do you have any remarks or comments? Like, what do you think about that? Who would like to go first? Monty, you got something to say?
No,
I can see your
I've
mouth
been
is
kind of
open.
chomping at the bit here on this one because this is actually something that I've been kind of concerned about a lot lately, right?
Okay, well, tell us your concerns.
Well, this is we have a lot of people who will fall into the trap of credentialism, right? And we've kind of see this kind of crumble in the last few years, especially after the effects of the pandemic and everything like that. Like, we're looking at experts, but those experts have been consistently wrong and have been more showing an agenda rather than actual concern for the truth and what is actually out there. But the thing is that this has also been permeating the church as well. I mean, I love that you brought up with Orson F. Whitney and a lot of the things that were concerning for him. But there's also a lot that's more recent than that. A lot of people like old historians and even some historians that are kind of proteges of these folks are very much in line with that. Leonard Arrington, I know a lot of people within the church have a lot of respect for him. The problem is that he didn't have a lot of respect for the brethren or for the revelatory powers. A lot of his history, especially when you dig into it, and his diaries especially, are very, very concerning. But one event in particular I wanted to focus on is particularly the Mark Hoffman affair. The bombings that happened in Salt Lake and everything like that, and the circumstances surrounding things like the Salamander letter, the Anthon transcript, the Joseph Smith III letter, like a whole bunch of things. Just a bit of a background, Mark Hoffman was a master forger. Like, he fooled a lot of people, academics and a lot of officials alike. But in the mid-'80s, especially, there were 3 bombs that went off that killed several people that could have blown the lid off of his entire operation. When the police were investigating this, they went to several of these historians, Leonard Arrington being one of them. And he actually told police investigators that they were going in the wrong direction, going after Hoffman. And he and several others that kind of labeled themselves as the new Mormon historians. And these were folks that were reliant on the Mark Hoffman forgeries, as well as so many different things that wanted to permeate their own view. And, among these would also be, Richard Bushman, who many people would point to as quoted as saying that the traditional narrative is no longer sustainable. Well, the only reason why it's no longer sustainable is because people like Mark Hoffman gave them permission to use different sources that not only were unfriendly to the church, so who knows what kind of incredible bias is there, but also inconsistent sources, placing more faith on second and third hand accounts that again may or may not be consistent with each other, not necessarily themselves, and allowing them to craft new narratives regarding church history, doctrine, and things like that. And we saw this huge tumult in the 80s, especially. President Hinckley addressed the Joseph Smith III letter in general conference, especially, and even the Salamander letter, which is Mark Kaufman's more in line of. But the thing is that like there were several that use this. In fact, in I want to say the fall 1987 dialogue from Journal for Mormon Thought actually addresses this straight out. That said, even if the Hoffman documents prove to be forgeries, Mark Hoffman has changed the landscape of Mormon history in generally positive ways. Think about that for a second. Forgeries had allowed them to change the narrative and to take in documentation that, one, is not true and have been demonstrably untrue, are inconsistent with each other in order to push narratives that have ultimately cost the faith and testimony of so many of our brothers and sisters in the church, and have even hindered missionary progress for a long while. And now there are plenty of folks who are going out there and saying, well, we've already known about this, they've printed this for years. Well, yes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. And
Yeah,
that's
I
a big
100%
problem
agree with that. I 100% agree with that. And actually, the Mark Hoffman story is a really important story. Richard Turley, he is a church historian. He did a whole book on the Mark Hoffman thing. And in that book, he brought up something that I think is really important. So have you guys heard the prophecy that it started out being Joseph F. Smith was the one that they attributed it to? In about 2013-ish, maybe early 2000s, it started being attributed to John Taylor. It's an apocalyptic dream where like mothers are killing their babies, there's like war happening, it's like really apocalyptic and dark, and it's horrific. And it was originally in I believe it was in the late 1800s, around 1890, that it popped up in the church. And it was circulating in Ogden. And I did a ton of research on this. If you go to my Facebook page, which is just like it's like an alternate profile I have, but it's for the channel name. It's Christ Pearls on Facebook, and it's like a public profile. One of the very first posts that I made on there was about this. And I had dug into this really deeply because I was trying to find out the source of this thing. And it's even on like the Joseph Smith Foundation website. Like there's a lot of people who believe that John Taylor, that this was his dream. But what I think the younger generation doesn't realize is this has already been beaten like a dead horse in past generations. And we know that it was not a dream by prophets and apostles, but it still gets passed around. The white horse prophecy is another one that was mentioned in the Mark Hoffman book, but this specific one by John Taylor is pretty insidious because people still attribute it to him. There's all kinds of reasons for that. I did a ton on that. You can look at that on my Facebook. Maybe I'll do a video on it at some point, but I had shared it a long time ago with my friend Jared, who does the Christian Homestead channel, and he did a video on it too. And it's just trying to show like that we know the sources that were claimed to have been the ones that had this vision. The church actually denounced this publicly in general conference more than once. It was denounced by like Joseph F. Smith. Joseph Fielding Smith did later too, because he was a descendant of Joseph F. Smith. And so like in the church, we know that this wasn't real, but people keep passing it around and they keep saying that it is. And so it becomes this false prophecy that people base their interpretations of scripture on, instead of the other way around. Instead of using the scriptures as the guide and the prophets and what they're saying collectively as the guide, they get this random prophecy. It's really sensational. And they're just like, yeah, this is it. And this is how it's going to be before the second coming and all these things. And so my point is, this is an example of who do you trust and why? Like, where are you receiving your information and why? And to your point, Monty, this comes out of this Hoffman case. That's what Richard Turley pointed out, was how these these false doctrines, they were starting to be planted in the church at the time that Joseph Smith was alive, before he died. And they've continued, they've persisted to grow. So think of like wheat and tares in that parable. We tend to think of it as people, but people are teaching something. And so I always kind of think of it like you really have to sift through what you're hearing and start to have this ability to discern truth from error. So with that said, you talked about scholarship. So let's talk a little bit about that. Like, how do you guys decide what sources of scholarship you trust, and what do you use as the measuring stick for that scholarship? Do you want to speak on that? Scott, do you have any opinions?
So trust, scholars build trust differently than a prophet would build trust, than the church builds trust, than God builds trust. And the scholarship trust factor is actually pretty measurable. Other factors in trust oftentimes are not when it comes to relationships, but a scholar puts out a paper, and one of the key metrics of trust on an academic paper is how many times it's referenced by other academics. So if you put out a paper and nobody ever references it or talks about it, then you are not trustworthy in your field of scholarship. That's how that works. And if it gets referenced and used a lot, you're considered more trustworthy. So there's lots of apologists that like to use scholars for their considerations that have been well documented, referenced, and used over the years, especially those that found different ideas, unlike biblical research, for example. And so another factor that comes in when it comes to how well you can trust them is whether or not they have a built-in bias. So, for example, an LDS apologist would be less trustworthy if they're spewing out a bunch of LDS content, but as soon as they go to like comment on Jewish culture or something like that, then it's like, okay, well, they probably have a better interest in being objective, and so you can factor in those things and stuff. But backing up for just a second, the idea that we need to trust is a huge topic. Like it's not like this is a 1 minute bit that's going to like answer everybody's questions on the concept of trust and who to trust, because this is actually a human experience problem. We're all trying to figure this out, and some of it's pretty black and white, a lot of it's gray, and there's a lot of things that you can understand and learn that help, but a lot of it's trial and error, just trying to understand the experience of trust, how our brains perceive it, what it's good for, and then realizing, oh, that didn't work. I can't trust them. I thought I could, but now I can. Now I'm headed over here. And you're constantly adjusting according to the people that you think you can and cannot trust. And of course, the church has a unique experience with that and its members and stuff that we can go into. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that. I want to pull in a couple of quotes. First of all, the first presidency had put out a message a couple of years ago. It's pulling from the church handbook, and where you can find this in the church handbook, I'm just going to give the reference. I'm not going to read it because it's kind of a long section, but it's about apostasy. It's in section 32.6.3.2 in the church handbook under the header apostasy. And they gave some bullet points. This was a handout given in a priesthood leadership training, and it's by Dallin H. Oaks. And the there were 4 things that he pointed out that you can identify a pattern of apostasy. I thought this was a helpful discernment tool because like Lion, when we were over on your channel and we were talking about the multiple mortal probations thing, I felt like this was coming to my mind. So he says, these are signs of personal apostasy. And this is a helpful rubric that maybe we can use to assess some of these voices and things that we're hearing. You know, even if we're talking about what apostles are saying, we can use this rubric, which I think is nice. So he says, one is focusing on past prophets instead of living ones. Another is claiming new knowledge over prophetic leadership. Another is teaching unrevealed doctrines. So that means like persisting in teaching things where we're waiting for more revelation. And then the other was rejecting counsel that's not aligned with the popular political or academic views of the day. So if a prophet or apostle says something and it's not popular politically or academically, we're like, nope, throw that out. This is a sign of patterns of personal apostasy. And I thought this was just kind of an interesting little rubric. Do you guys have any thoughts, opinions? Have you used this type of rubric to help you?
I would say in a way that I have. I mean, this goes back to what I was talking about earlier about Second Nephi 9:28 and 29, right? Like we when it comes to going back to the first question, like who can we trust more and more? The problem is, like when you were talking about that, Scott, like the more people that are referenced and things like that, like are generally more trustworthy. The problem is that after a while we lose the original source that was being quoted and was being referenced and things like that. And so these interpretations often get intermingled with each other. I mean, we see this happening throughout all of the different scholars, like just sticking with church history or church scholarship or things like that. Like you can kind of know where things are more reliant on commentary as far as the answers being given and primary source documents, right? And that I think is one of the big telltale signs, like maybe things aren't quite as above board as they really ought to be. I mean, just looking at the gospel topics essays and looking at the footnotes and everything like that there, we can kind of tell, like, okay, they're referencing a specific document from the Joseph Smith papers. But why are they now, like when they're trying to apply this, why are they referencing a commentary from such and such a scholar? Why is that? And then when you go to that commentary and they're like, okay, they have the primary source documents here. Wait, these primary source documents don't say anything about what this commentary is trying to assert or what this commentary on the commentary is trying to assert. And so it ends up becoming just big, self-congratulatory thing within this inner group of people. But kind of like what you were saying, like if you don't necessarily know something regarding, Jewish culture and history, who would you go to? I would say that commentaries can be useful as a starting point, not as the end all be all. And if they're referencing other commentaries for their, for supporting their thesis, I think there's a problem there because we need to have those primary source documents so that we can learn for ourselves. We shouldn't be lazy learners on that part.
However,
Yeah.
one point, and I just want to counter that, so I'm going to play devil's advocate on this. One point that I would like to make and that I see happening in the church, in our subculture, is people saying that they want to see the primary source documents, but they have no training or ability to sift through those documents and be able to, put it into a proper context. So like, for instance, I'm going to give an example. You may have heard him say this, but I really like Don Bradley when he talked about his approach to how he did his book, The Lost 116
Mhm.
Pages. He was talking about how he took the primary source documents, he found lots of different conversations about the scriptures that were lost, and he put them into a timeline. And he has like a lot of historical training, right? He'd been doing research for years, he was trained in this, and he explained a process. Well, I don't know that I have that skill set, for example. And one thing that I see happening right now, and this goes back to the Leonard Arrington thing, is a rewriting of church history. So people are looking at the same old documents on any topic, name a topic, it doesn't matter what it is. They're all looking at the same stuff. There's nothing new, and they're just reinterpreting it through a different lens. And then this is creating all of these different opinions. I mean, you can find any opinion you want in scholarship. The question is, why are you gravitating towards it? And what do you use as your measuring stick? So I don't know, Scott, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so primary sources are very important. As you're hearing these ideas and trying to explore different scholars, you need to be able to verify that what you're looking at is a true representation of whatever the original idea was. In my mind, Darwin's a classic example. He gets credit for the theory of evolution when he actually didn't believe in the theory of evolution. They just used his little snippets of research to pull forward and create something that he never conceived of, because he actually believed that humans did not come from monkeys because there was no evidence for it. Not that it was like impossible or God or whatever. There was just no evidence for it. And so I don't think that it's fair to take scholars at their word, even if they are highly researched. The other side of this, though, is this kind of caricature that we get blamed for. And I was going to see if Mama had any thoughts on this, but every once in a while you hear somebody say, "Oh, The LDS Church tells their members not to do research. Don't read any other books. Don't go outside. Don't get on the internet. Like just listen to the prophets. That's all you need to know, and ignore everybody else, and only read the scriptures, no other books. And that's kind of the other side of that spectrum, right? Where it's one side is diving into the research and trying to find reasons to prioritize that over revelation. The other side is saying the only thing we'll ever need is what the prophet says in general conference. And those two ends
Yeah,
of
I
the
think those
spectrum,
are
I
the
think,
two
were,
extremist
yeah,
kind of views that I'm talking about. It's like it goes really far one way or really far the other way.
yeah. I think the balance there is really important. And I don't think the balance is necessarily hard. I think what happens is that you have personalities that have some motivation to have an experience, whether it's related to, I don't know, their upbringing, trauma, whatever's going on in their life, and they have a desire to, maybe it's be special or be recognized or simplify their life. And maybe it's a concept of overconfidence, which, if you look at the words, overconfidence is the same thing as having too much faith. It's the same as having too much trust. Like, you shouldn't be trusting that thing that much, even if it's yourself. So you have this overconfidence in some idea that you have. So you take that and you put it forward as if it's the most important thing that anybody will ever hear, and you don't take the time to contrast it against whether it's the words of the prophets or your doctor or whoever else you need to be taken in consideration that has built trust with you. You say, no, 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 no. I know better than everybody because XYZ, and therefore I'm going to put this out there. And that's why the definitions of apostasy that the church uses are, if you're putting yourself out there in this overconfident state against the church, that's a sign that you're not taking into consideration the word of God, the word of prophets, etc.
I actually kind of like how you're saying it's a sign. And I think that that's a good way to think about it. It's like the rubric that's given by the first presidency. It helps you identify signs that if all of those things are happening, this becomes a pattern. And if you see that pattern over and over again on any of these things that are noted, then it, I guess if you're the viewer, you're the one out there trying to sift through information, and you're noticing, like, I see this person always focusing on past prophets instead of the living prophets, that's a sign. Or I see this scholar, claiming new knowledge over what prophets and apostles have said collectively over time for a long time. And I think that's important. And I want to get Mama Sosa back on here because we need a lady's opinion here too. And I like this conversation because we all run into this, right? Like when you're online and you're having conversations, especially when you're in these interfaith dialogues, like this kind of stuff comes up. And when you're trying to figure out how to tackle any type of topic, you have to figure out what sources you're going to go to for trustworthy information in any type of discussion on any gospel topic, especially if it's like a heated one. So I don't know, Mama Sosa, do you have a way that you approach sifting through scholarship versus, the scriptures versus what prophets and apostles have said? Do you have an approach that you use to help you discern truth from error?
I think a lot of times too, scholars go with what's okay with society or what's, if that makes sense. Like, for example, they'll be like, oh, well, they say IVF is safe. Or they'll be like, oh, well, drinking green tea is good for you. But that's what the scholars say. That's what the people with, doctorate degrees say. Like, is it like look more profound into it? Like, is it really what like if you're gonna hold that to a standard, then you need to hold like what prophets say to a standard as well, if that makes sense. Like I think a lot of times people want to reference to something kind of like what Monty said, like they'll take all day what a scholar says. Oh, that's true, because he got a doctorate degree. You know what I mean? The way that I personally do is I've never been really I never just forgive me for not like being very well versed at this. I never really thought of it. I just think it more like, and this might be not a very good response, a lot of common sense. A lot of things are very much like common sense instead of it making me feel warm and fuzzy. You know what I mean? Because a lot of times we want something to validate the way that we feel sometimes, and because if it's a scholar, then oh, it validates what I'm saying. It's bringing up that point. So I don't know if that made sense. I apologize for not
So
being very well
so
versed.
would you, and I'm going to try to clarify, so let me ask you a question just to make sure I'm understanding. So it sounds like there's kind of like a self-assessment that you're describing where you're kind of checking with yourself internally about how you feel about something, what it's doing to you in your feelings. And
Mm-hmm.
I like this idea because I think that discernment actually does start with how you feel, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this might even go back to a conversation that I had with Vex where we were talking about the ego and how if something is feeding your ego, it might be a really good place to pause and just check yourself. And I noticed that for me in my life on anything. It doesn't even have to necessarily do with apologetics, just like any decision I'm going to make.
Mm-hmm.
And I've noticed that there's a connection between like just that ego. And I think it goes back to what President Oakes pointed out, where it's like focusing on past prophets instead of living ones. Well, why would you do that? It might be what you said. It might be that there's an ego that's being fed, like they're validating what you think or feel without challenging it. And then this like, or claiming no, like new knowledge over prophetic leadership. So it's like some new scholarship comes out and you really like it and you gravitate to it. Why are you gravitating to it? And I think this might be an important part of that process that I don't know if I had thought about prior to this, but there's one thing that I want to bring into this that I think can tie in here. You guys have probably heard this statement. It comes from the official Declaration 1. It's by President Wilford Woodruff, where he said, quote, "The Lord will never permit me or any other man who stands as president of this church to lead you astray. It is not in the program. It is not in the mind of God. If I were to attempt that, the Lord would remove me out of my place." This often gets used as kind of like a follow the prophet counsel. And in connection with that, we have a couple of quotes by Joseph Smith. There's actually two that I want to read. I had one of them pulled up here, and then there's another one that I want to read before that because I think they go together. So Joseph Smith said, "I will give you one of the keys of the mysteries of the kingdom. It is an eternal principle that has existed with God from all eternity. That man who rises up to condemn others, finding fault with the church, saying that they are out of the way while he himself is righteous, then know assuredly that that man is in the high road to apostasy, and if he does not repent, will apostatize as God lives. The key is this: a man is his own accuser. Look for that man who accuses the church, the brethren, and those called to lead, and the spirit of apostasy will be there." But then Joseph Smith also gave us a discernment tool. And I think this is interesting because he lived through an apostasy. I mean, the first, like 8 of the first original 12 apostles apostatized, 4 of them came back in time. And so Joseph Smith, he seemed to be very well acquainted with apostasy and apostates. And one of the tools of discernment he gave to us in the church, he said, "I will give you a key that will never rust. If you will stay with the majority of the 12 apostles and the records of the church, you will never be led astray." And then so when you look at that compared to what Wilford Woodruff said, which is canonized in the official Declaration 1, about how the Lord will never permit him or any other man who stands as president of the church to lead us astray, what are your thoughts on that, you guys? Like, how does that make you feel? Does it enhance your trust in the living prophets and the structure that we have that was part of the restoration? Or do you still feel, I don't know, like uneasy about it? Like, who do you personally choose to trust?
Just real quick, I'll pass it off, but the current, not current, I guess, the modern day prophet that says this same thing, just in case anybody's wondering if this is like an old doctrine that we don't use anymore or something like that. Elder Ballard talked about this all the time. Like almost every single general conference, this was his topic. And that's why everybody thought he was so boring, because he'd always talk about the same stuff over and over again. And his message was basically stay in the old ship Zion. Remember that talk? Where it's just like, just stay with us, be patient, don't get distracted with crazy ideas, just hang out with the main group and you'll be just fine.
Yeah, and you know he was actually quoting Brigham Young, which I
Oh,
love
yeah.
because you have a modern apostle quoting an older prophet. And then you know who else said that was Boyd K. Packer. He did a whole talk, The Old Ship Zion too. He was another one of those who would repeat these quotes from these older former day prophets in our modern period of time since the start of the Restoration. He would quote them and he would say this over and over again, the old ship Zion. And I think this is something that we still hear to this very day. Like, I'm going to give an example from a more recent talk, but David A. Bednar, he gave two recently. One was, I think, in April of, I want to say last year. I think it was April 2024, but it was the one, the Be Still and Know That I Am God. And he gave us an analogy. It's about building on the rock. In there, there's pictures that you can look at that kind of go with what he's saying. But the analogy is that Jesus Christ is the bedrock, and the foundation that we're built on is on that bedrock. So you have the bedrock, then you build the foundation of the house on the bedrock, then you have those like steel rods that go through the foundation into the bedrock to secure the foundation to the bedrock. Then you build your house on top of that. And the idea behind that analogy is that Jesus Christ is the bedrock, like Helaman chapter 5, verse 12, right? Like the rock. But the foundation is the revelation of the prophets and apostles who are special witnesses of Jesus Christ to his resurrection, to testify that Jesus really was resurrected. He is God. He's the Savior. And that continuous revelation is the foundation for the church. And then those metal rods he likened to the covenants. So the covenants come from Jesus Christ, that bedrock. So we're secure in the bedrock, and then they go through the foundation to secure the house. So think of the house as like all of us, the church, like everything. You can think of it individually, you can think of it collectively, but we're all secured to Jesus Christ through the covenants that we make that come through those appointed and anointed servants who are the foundation of revelation that is talked about by Peter, and just kind of like the concept that we're built on with a living church. And so I really liked his analogy because to me, it helps me understand in some ways the relationship that I have to the prophets and apostles and what they can do for me to help me discern. So do you guys have any thoughts on that? Like how do you see your relationship with the prophets and apostles?
This is where having that spiritual witness is so important, right? Like, think about how often we sustain these brethren every 6 months as prophets, seers, and revelators. That's not to say that we, think that they're perfect by any means or any stretch of the imagination. I mean, Joseph Smith even said, a prophet is only a prophet when he's acting as such. But it is to also recognize the callings that they hold. They have that ability to receive revelation from on high. And I do find it interesting that the quote is, the majority of the 12. Maybe not necessarily all of the 12, but when the voice of the 12 is truly united, especially with that of the first presidency, it is truly miraculous, truly a wonder to behold. Because then you can actually are certain that yes, God is at the helm. This is the Church of Jesus Christ, and He's the one who's directing it. But that, I think, none of that would ultimately matter if we don't also have that spiritual witness for ourselves. That we know that God can speak to us, and that as a result of that He has given these 15 men authority to act in His name and to speak on His behalf. But we also have to be willing to recognize, okay, is he actually speaking as a prophet, or is this something that is more along the lines of his opinion? I mean, think about what happened 5 years ago with the pandemic and everything like that. When the vaccine came out, a lot of people, the first presidency did send out a press release, and that's important to recognize. It was a press release. To recognize that, yes, we should be getting the vaccine, but to also talk to your healthcare provider, see if that's the right way to go. A lot of people completely disregarded that second part of it. Go to your healthcare provider, see what is appropriate for you in your life, and just say, well, the prophet said to go get the vaccine. Everybody go do it, and if you don't, you're an apostate. Like, wait, no, that's not how it's supposed to go. But the thing is, though, is that there are even reports of, like, even Elder Razban just getting so upset. The prophet said to get it. Why aren't these people getting it? That's kind of an apocryphal thing. No one really has been able to confirm that.
I don't think he said that.
I don't either.
And I'm going to tell you why. Because it's not available on the church's website anymore, but there was a clip that was going around where he was talking in a private meeting, and it was one of those devotionals, where the apostles will
Yeah.
go around and they'll talk to, like, on a stake level to people, and it'll be posted, like, on the link just for people to access it during the time, and then it gets taken down. But he had made a statement to this effect, remarking on that, and he was basically reminding everyone that agency was always a part of this press release. It was never that the prophet was commanding everyone to go and do this. It was simply just counsel of how to maybe deal with that situation, and agency was included in that counsel. And I think that's important to remember, because if somebody's saying that he was saying that the prophet commanded that, I'm going to testify that I saw him say that no, he did not. That's not true.
And it's interesting how it kind of got transformed. It's like, oh, Razban was so angry, and like, why aren't they following the prophet? And you're right, that's not what he said at all. And it's not. And the thing is too is that it didn't go through the proper priesthood channel, so there was no way. So because it didn't go through those channels, meaning it didn't go out as a letter to be read in sacrament meeting, for instance. And it wasn't addressed to the Area 70s, the bishops, stake presidents, to be read in these meetings. That is something that we can take as okay, this may be actually revelation from the Lord. This may be something that we may need to take a little bit more seriously. But going as far as a press release, no, not at all. But this also kind of goes into, what aspects of church publications can we trust too? Is it just from the brethren that we can trust, or can we trust public affairs or these other resources that are out there? I mean, you and I have had plenty of discussions with representatives from other organizations talking about this very thing, which kind of spurred this entire discussion, to be quite frank.
It kind of did.
But what would it, so if an apostle did say something like that, and if apostle said something like, I disagree with this, or this group is going to be apostate, or you have to do it this way, I think it's kind of a red herring to jump on the idea that it didn't happen. Like, if you look at the videos or the comments about, oh, the LDS apostle lied, and you go to what they're saying is a so-called lie, and it's kind of silly. But then I always think, well, what if they did lie? I don't understand what the point is. Like, what if the apostle did get angry? What if they said XYZ thing? I mean, that's kind of what the CES letter is, right? It's like this list of things that could be really bad. And then you say, well, if they are all true, therefore what? Like, all of a sudden everything else is not true? What's the point?
Right. And this is where context is ultimately important, and going back to those primary sources that they claim to source and things like that. And there should be things that should be taken with a grain of salt, especially if that source cannot be found, like if they're making it up or whatnot. Some of the videos that I've done within the last month have had these exact issues. Well, they will take and quote mine and take snippets of videos of people from the church and things like that saying these things like, oh, it's so nefarious, this is so against scripture and things like that. And yet, when the full quote is brought up in context, it says the exact opposite of the narrative that they're trying to spin.
But what they're basing, like, the premise of their problem is not a problem in almost all cases that I've seen, where they present something and they present it wrong, like to your point, Monty, like, it's out of context, it's manipulative, it's wrong. But even aside from that, if it was actually true, whatever they're claiming, their understanding of how church works, how revelation works, is misguided. I
think this is probably the most important point, because this is why Joseph Smith gave us this key that will never rust, right? It's because he's teaching the collective witness model. He's saying you need to look at the collective witness over time, and you need to stay with the majority of the apostles and the records of the church. So he's saying stay with the church records, the majority of the apostles, and you will not be led astray. Well, when you put that in connection with what is canonized by Wilford Woodruff in the official declaration, and I hear people say this all the time, that they don't agree with Wilford Woodruff when he said this, but this is literally in our scriptures. And I think it's because there's a really good point there, and that is that you should be able to trust that God is the one leading the church, that Jesus Christ himself appoints the prophets. And this actually is kind of going to lead into another part here. And I think this is my view, and you guys can disagree with this, but I think it's helpful for me to look at first, what do the scriptures actually say about any topic? Whatever the gospel doctrine is that's in question, whatever the church history thing that's in question. If it's church history, I'm going to go to the Doctrine and Covenants first and see what's canonized. And then I would go start looking at where, the source documents and things like that. And then I would look at what modern prophets and apostles have been saying since the time of the restoration up through now, like the collective witness model. And the way you can do that is really easy. You can just start a study by topic, and you can go look at all the quotes that you can find and put them in a timeline, like trying to see, has there been a progression over time on this topic? Has it changed? Like, were they saying one thing in the 1800s, one thing in the 1900s, and another thing in the 2000s? And you have a history now. Like back in the early days of the church, you didn't have this really wonderful tool that we have of being able to do this, but we can. And so that has been really helpful to me when I'm sorting through, just different, no matter what it is, whatever the topic is, you name it, this model seems to work really well for me. And then I incorporate the gift of the Holy Ghost. This is where now I have to say, okay, I've got my prophets and apostles and what they have said. I'm looking at the majority opinion that they've given, and I'm going to put a heavier weight on that because that was the key that Joseph Smith gave me. That's something I can trust. And then I'm going to look at what the scriptures actually say and make sure that those things align. And then I'm going to pray about it, and I'm going to see what the Spirit's telling me. And truth be told, if I feel like the Spirit that I'm listening to is telling me something that is in stark contrast to what the scriptures are saying and what the prophets are saying, if those things are not all aligned, then I know I still have work to do. Because until I can see that all three of these things come into perfect alignment and that it's like a triangle with 60-degree angles, right? Like an equilateral triangle, the angles should all be equal. They all need to be in alignment for me to hone in on that true core doctrine or the truth. And if something's off somewhere, then I know that I need to keep searching and keep finding it, because it should all line up. And this reminds me of Joseph Smith, who also said the proving contraries quote, right? It's like the true doctrine is going to be found in that tension, in the tension. And I have found this to be so true in my life. I could name so many times where I've delved into topics, and I find this to be just spot on. It's like you'll find tension in the scriptures, maybe tension with the way a scripture is being interpreted, and maybe what the living prophets have said about it. You may find a scholarly point of view that's in contention with what the prophets and apostles have said about a passage of scripture, meaning that you're getting two different interpretations. And this causes tension, and you have to say, okay, how do I discern now? And that gift of the Holy Spirit is how we discern. Discernment is a gift of the Spirit, right? So you have to learn to utilize it. And these are some of the tools that I've felt have helped me so much as I've kind of grown and matured in my understanding of the gospel. Because you guys, there are so many things in church history that can upset you or you can be mad about. And I've been through that range of emotions, and I've come full circle. And the full circle that I came to is I can trust, for the most part, the church's official narrative on its own history. And there's always going to be little points of tension, but I can see over time that for the most part, this is a good foundation, and it helps me. So I don't know, do you guys have, like, we haven't heard from Mama Sosa. Let's hear what she has to say. You guys talk a lot. You guys have really good ideas, but I really want to have this discussion with everyone. And so, like, what is your approach? Like, do you feel like when you come across, like, let's say you come across a doctrine, for example, and you're like, somebody's teaching it a certain way and you're not sure about it. Where do you start? How do you start to sift through that teaching that you've heard or received? It could be a social media post. It could be something someone told you. Where do you go first? How do you start?
So there's two talks that I thought about on how I choose to approach it. So we'll start with the first one. Do you guys remember the pornography in 2009 with, I forgot who said it, but it was a pornography talk and it went viral on TikTok. And they took a 30-second clip of the clip, and it was like, women, if you dress immodestly, you're part of the problem, and then clipped it. And then that was it. This was back in '09 or 2001. Again, don't take this on me, by all means, but it was during that time frame. Okay, that was in '09. I remember watching it and I was like, let me go find the full thing. I watched the full thing, and the head title of it was pornography. And I was like, and it was just talking about like how the uh porn industry is just it's horrible for men, it's horrible for women, it's just how it can hurt you spiritually. And just in that context, feel free to go watch it. And I recommend go watching it. And how they grabbed that one clip of the apostle just strictly saying the very triggering and high tension thing that can ruffle a lot of feathers. But then when you watch it fully, he didn't say anything wrong. He was, and so, and then another thing too, that was back in '09 or '01. I'm sure it was '09. Look at fast forward today. What is the number one platform that mainly women are on? OnlyFans.
Probably. Oh, OnlyFans. Oh, wow. That's actually news to me. So tell me more about that.
So if you really think there's 1 to 1.3 million people, majority are female, on OnlyFans. So when he was saying that, that was prophecy for today.
I like that. I like that you
So,
even made the connection because, I mean, you're right. The internet and social media landscape changed a ton in those 10 years.
and guess who was very much triggered and had high tension? Feminist. People that think, oh, men are trying to oppress. Is it the man or the bear? Really think about it. Really, really think about it. The porn industry is very big and it's very sad. And if women choose to go dress immodestly and to put explicit pictures of this of themselves, you're not helping. You are not helping. You're
You know,
making it much worse for men's and women specifically, because not only men struggle with pornography, women do too. So when you view it at a triggering point, like, oh, he was being misogynistic. Like, no, he was not. He was speaking facts. So
well, doesn't it
put your
kind of
emotions
remind you of
aside.
the newer one that happened with the garment thing? The lady, like the ladies kind of went off about the garment thing, and I find that all the time. And again, this is like little snippets, right, that get shared on social media, and
Hmm.
then somebody goes off on it. And I think you're right. I think that you do have to pause and just be like, okay, before I start freaking out about this, let me just go dig into this a little bit more. And I think 90% of the time you find that it is something that's being taken out of context, but I don't know if we all pause to do that.
And again, that's where scholars prove my point that it's a problem. There's a big problem. The prophets called it, scholars proved it. Because if you're not going to believe the prophets, then you're going to believe the scholars. You see what I'm saying? How all this plays into play in a positive way? Like, you get what I'm saying? Like, that's going to sound funny. The prophets clocked it. Now the scholars will prove my point in a way. So,
Yeah,
anyways.
it's true because on like almost any topic that
Hmm.
exists in culture, like in our culture at large, you can go back at least a decade and you'll see that we started having warnings about whatever it is. And I think that's true. Like you see it with the Family Proclamation, you see it with pornography. I mean, President Hinckley started talking about this way back in the 90s, as soon as, like, right before and right as the internet was starting to be developed, right? Like before it got to what it is, we already started hearing about this. In fact, I can testify to this because I remember back in the day, like being in junior high and high school, and they were giving out like little statements by our prophets and apostles about this specific thing and about internet safety, and we would get them in like young women's and young men's. So I think that the church has been onto it. Like the prophets and apostles, they see around corners, right? Like Sherry do said, they do see that. But the question is, are we trusting them? Are we listening to them? and and I hope that, like, maybe today one of the takeaways that people can have as they're listening is just thinking about your approach. Like when you have a question come up or something isn't sitting right with you, it could be something that you've heard in the church that was taught in Sunday school, or it could be literally something you hear over the pulpit at general conference,
Right.
which does have a level of authority, right? But then how
And
do you approach it?
so that was the first talk, and how I approached it was more like, this is what how I did it. And then the second one was, and I'm sure everybody, it took everybody by wind, that we shouldn't call ourselves Mormon anymore. That like took everybody by, it took me by wind, because I grew up with Gordon B. Hinckley being proud to be Mormon, the Mormon campaign, all of it. So whenever I heard it at first, I was like, you know what? Let me do my research. Let me do my complete research. Is this an opinion or is this the prophet speaking? So what I started doing digging is on the talks of all about using the word Mormon, using this, using that. I went back to the March of 1990 when Russell M. Nelson was an apostle at the time. And Gordon B. Hinckley was a prophet. Russell M. Nelson had always quote a opinion on the fact that we call ourselves Mormon, and Gordon P. Hinckley felt the total opposite. So when I view it like, okay, you've had your opinion based on that. Now that you're at a position of authority, now it becomes relevant. Why was it not relevant when you were an apostle? Do you see what I'm saying? So whenever it comes to that, it's more coming based on my research and how, like you said, you have to fight for it until it makes more sense for you. After I did my research, I prayed about it and I received my personal revelation on it. And that's not me going back on like, because it's validating because of what is said in the past. Is it a personal opinion or is it speaking for God, so to speak? So again, like that's what I'm saying. And also I also put my feelings aside because of how much I loved calling myself Mormon, and I still do. And I've received a lot of backlash on social media. That's why I did my research on it, because a lot of people were like, the prophet said not to call yourself a Mormon, so you shouldn't call yourself a Mormon. But
Yeah,
I mean, do you see what
I
I'm
see what
saying?
you're,
So
yeah,
like,
I see what you're saying because you're
so,
like, okay, just because he said that, like you're talking about people who are taking it to an extreme. Like you
yes,
can never say the
never
word
say it again.
Mormon again.
Like,
And that's kind
and
of like what we're talking about, right? Like it's going really far in one direction. But if you go back and you look at those statements, right, then you see some context and you're like, okay, there's some history happened. So I'll point out one thing that I noticed with that is that there's a progression, right? Like there was a different time and a different thing that the church was trying to do back in the 90s under Gordon B. Hinckley. One of those things was we were trying to build bridges across the world with other nations and other religions to expand the missionary effort. And President Hinckley, being in public relations his whole life, he was really good at this. He was good at like bridging the gaps and engaging with the media and the public, and he helped to kind of bring the church even further out of obscurity, which is one of the prophecies of the signs of the times.
mhm,
And then I think you see a shift happen after about the years of Thomas S. Monson, where we kind of started transitioning into a different internet realm than what we had back then. And now the church, starts being under attack. We start seeing all kinds of social media attacks happening that didn't exist in the 90s. We were still trying to be known at that point across the world. Now we're a global organization. We're known across the world. We have a prophet and apostle going and meeting with somebody constantly from other nations. All you have to do is follow church news to see that. But now we're in a different landscape, a different social media internet landscape that didn't exist back then. And I love this because now I see how President Nelson was inspired back then. He was thinking about it back then. And you can see that that difference has maybe a little less to do with them like digging in their heels, at least for me it did, versus like, what do we need right now to guide the church today? And this is what I think is so interesting about having a living church and why I'm so grateful for living prophets and apostles, because I can see that they develop training as an apostle for many, many decades before they're called as the prophet, because of this law of divine succession where it's like one prophet dies and then the senior apostle becomes the prophet. And you can see the Lord has been tutoring whoever that person is for a long time. And then the Lord gives them experiences to help them start to develop the mindset that they're going to need to be able to lead the church for that day. And this is something that I think the Christian world at large has completely overlooked about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is what a blessing it is to have prophets and apostles on the earth today, just like the primitive church. I'm grateful for it. What about you guys? We should do final thoughts too, because we've got about 10 minutes. So maybe each of you guys take about 3-4 minutes. Yeah, I like that. Scott, do you want to give some closing remarks?
I learned the other day that there's actually a hashtag in YouTube. I just looked it up to see what came up, but the hashtag is Mormon Leader, and you can imagine the videos that come up. They're not very helpful for the church, and there is no hashtag for LDS Leader. And so I think that kind of, I've been playing with some of those things with the word Mormon, just trying to figure out what I want to do with it. And so it's been interesting to see how it shows up. But I want to close with an idea going back to the word trust, because we probably can think about the word trust a little more carefully. It applies to the church a lot differently than it would, differently than we assume in a lot of our relationships. If, with maybe my wife and I, we are each building trust with each other. So I do things to help her understand how she can and can't trust me. And as I watch her throughout our marriage, I'm deciding whether or not I can trust her in different areas. And the church is doing the same thing. They are trying to build trust with us, and we are trying to build trust with them. And we do that in different ways, very similar to how we would in a relationship. The problem is that trust is very synonymous with faith. And so if you say, I have faith in God, what you're trying to communicate is, I trust God. The problem is, God isn't here to tell me how I can trust him. He proves his trust to me over time. And that's difficult. It's very hard to trust God for days, weeks, months, and years. And I've had experiences where I leaned on God and I expected him to help me with something. He didn't show up. And I was very upset, and I was very hard on my faith. Fast forward months later, I look back and realized he was actually there the whole time. He just didn't show up the way that I expected. But I had the faith to persist and look back to understand how that trust was actually validated through God's commitment to me. A lot of people don't wait for that. A lot of people don't give God the time that it takes to build that trust. They say, oh, he broke trust, I'm out of here. And they bolt. That can be seen as a lack of faith, but it's also a lack of patience in just giving God the time that he needs to build trust with us. So thanks.
It's really beautiful. I like that you related this to a marriage relationship too, because as I've gotten older and more mature, I used to think of Jesus Christ as like my big brother. And I think of him now like he's my husband, because I've realized that there's like this really deep, profound experience that you can have that becomes very intimate with Jesus Christ when you start to view your relationship with him through the eyes of like a covenant marriage. And I think that this started to become real to me when I was sealed to my husband in the temple, because I started to recognize that there was something different in my life than all the years before of, having been married before and having a failed marriage, having been a single parent. I've just come to rely on the Lord so much. And I've felt that the Lord has blessed me with the ability to discern truth from error along the way. And there were times when I can see that I wasn't really doing that very well. And then I can see that I've gotten a little better at it as my mindset has shifted in how I'm approaching these things. And what it does for me is it actually gives me a witness of the living prophets and this concept that was restored, that there's prophets on the earth again who speak to God again and deliver messages and revelation again. And like the more that I start to do this process of like, what do the scriptures say? What do the prophets say? Now, what is the Spirit telling me? And I understand that my obedience plays a role in this, not just obedience to what I think I'm supposed to do on my own without any input, but just to the program, the old ship Zion concept, to the program. I find that this program is very, very helpful to my ability to discern. And so that's kind of like where my testimony is rooted in. In fact, I think it reminds me of, like Elder Holland said recently, President Jeffrey R. Holland, he's the acting president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, when he said, dream dreams and see visions. And he was talking to like the leaders of the Dominican Republic. And he said, whatever you think the church is going to be, it's going to be a lot more than that. It is the one thing that I know for sure is going to succeed. I'm not sure about economies. I'm not sure about politics. I'm not sure about business. I'm not sure about universities or hospitals. I don't know what's going to work and what's going to fail, but I know one thing that's going to work. And I know one thing that's never, ever, ever going to fail. And it is the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. And it sort of harkens a message, like a theme that I kept hearing over the last few general conferences about, not selling our birthright. Like, think about this like noble birthright that we've been given. Think about what this church has been prophesied to do. Did Joseph Smith really restore, or is there like another apostasy that's prophesied? Was there one great apostasy, or were there multiple? Like how, what do the scriptures say? And one thing that I loved is how president, or not president, but Elder Bednar, he had used a quote. He said in October 2024, in the space of not many years, where he was specifically talking about apostasy. And he explained how at the individual level, each of us must be aware of pride, lest we become like the Nephites of old, right? And that's kind of what we're talking about here too, is there's like this ego, kind of going back to the ego that exists in all of us. This includes scholars. Prophets and apostles are not exempt from this. Like, we all have this, and we have to like check that ego. But one thing we can trust in, I think, is what Elder Bednar pointed out here, is what the scriptures say. And the scriptures gave a prophecy about the church and the destiny of the church. And if you can align all those scriptures on the prophet Joseph Smith and that dawn of restoration, that last dispensation, there's something that you can come to know. And it is what Wilford Woodruff said, that the Lord prophesied that he would not let the church be led astray, that when that gospel is restored in the last days, it'll go all the way through to the end of the millennium. And there's not going to be a falling away and another new dispensation. This is the last dispensation. So if you can identify if you're living in the last dispensation, then you can know with confidence. And so he quoted Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery from like those days where they talked about the standard of truth, had been erected. No one hallowed hand can stop the work from progressing. If you understand the scriptures, then you know that that's true. And that's something else that I've come to know. And I think that's why, for me, that triangle analogy is really important, because we have living prophets and apostles, but we don't just have that. We have scriptures, we have what they say about it, and then we have the Spirit. And if those things can come into alignment, it'll help wherever we see tension. It's the proving contraries idea. So that's kind of like, for me, been the best tool and help in how to like approach my assessment of where can I place my trust. Really, ultimately, we're supposed to trust in the Lord, but he's given us tools to help us know that we can trust him. And I think those tools are the prophets and the apostles, the scriptures, and the gift of the Holy Ghost. So that's kind of my last thought. Anybody else want to, Mama Sosa, do you want to say anything? We've got about 5
Uh,
minutes.
got you. Yeah. I think that just whenever it comes to hearing the prophets and the leaders, even your bishopric, even in the people in the ward, and how they feel to choose to lead, whatever circumstance or level, so to speak. Even in your home, I mean, with your priesthood holder as well, hold it to the same standard. Um, I think one, like we talked about emotions and stuff, a lot of the stuff that the prophets and leaders say is very triggering. And you have to be ready to be triggered, because those triggers are going to heal you. And if you don't feel, you won't heal. So therefore, if you're going to keep these balls of emotion, oh well, the way he said it, the way he this, really understand what they're saying. Don't get your whole self in a wad. Really step back and look at it. Is this directed towards me, or is this society? Like, where is this going to play at, right? I think too, people really are having a problem with self-accountability, because a lot of things that a lot of the prophets and apostles say is more like it's internal and what you need to fix. It's like a you versus you. It's not really like, oh, I'm telling you to go do it. No, I'm telling you what's best for you. Go and do it for yourself so you can see what I'm telling you is true. That's all they're saying. So I think just don't be so emotional towards it. Don't get me wrong, a lot of the stuff they say is hard. Truth is hard, and it's very uncomfortable. You have to be in an uncomfortable position to be comfortable with Christ. Because, I mean, think about it. Me transitioning from making 3 grand a week to making half as that. Yeah, it was truly uncomfortable. It was scary. You know what I mean? Like, I completely get it. But it's that sacrifice and that understanding and that struggle is what's going to really heal you. And you have to go through that. And it's a very tough road, and it's a straight, narrow path. That's why they say that it's a straight, narrow path. They don't mean that lightly. Like, it's thin, brother. It's thin, and you're gonna bat back and forth. So really, guys, just take what the prophets and apostles say to heart, but in a positive way. And
I
I,
love that you
I
said the thing about what maybe I'll have to say it again, but you said something that just hit me really hard and it kind of made me want to cry. So I feel like I need to point
mhm.
this out. But it
Go
was
ahead,
like
yeah.
the uncomfortable, like you have to be in an uncomfortable position to be comfortable with Christ. And
You have to every time.
that hit me so hard right now because I feel like that is so true, you guys. It is so true. Like the Lord, he's going to peel the onion. He's going to get to the core. It's the surgery, the spiritual surgery that Elder Maxwell talked about. It's like, that is what he does. And when you feel like something that's like pricking your soul, and it's like uncomfortable and discomfort happens, this is like a really good sign that the Lord is working with you. And I just love that you said that. And this is why you
And
have to have a woman's perspective on these things, because women, they like, we're so emotional, and like
mhm.
she's hitting something really hard here, which is that like trust is an emotion that you feel. And I think that is why it can be really confusing.
No,
So,
it really can be. And to really fully close, I think to it's you have to fight for your faith every single day. If you, and listen to what I'm about to say, if you think that your faith, if you're going through a faith crisis right now, and you think, oh, well, that doesn't make any sense, so I'm gonna just leave that there. But you ain't gonna get nowhere. You have to fight for your faith, whether if it's in the church or not. It doesn't matter. Your faith and your relationship with Christ is the first essential thing. Fix it, heal it, make it stronger. Make that rock very hard, so hard in your heart that no one can move it, because everything else will go into place. A lot of things might not make sense right now, but that's where you have to fight. And if you, that's what it is. Being a disciple of Christ is discipline. It's hard work. It's constant work. That's so, I mean, that's just really to close with that. I think people have to put in the work. And I'm not calling nobody lazy. I'm just taking it from my experience. Like, yeah, it was very easy for me to make 3 grand, but then now where I'm at and I'm full of peace, I'll take that in any day. I won't
and
work in
I
an
love
industry
that.
like that.
That's like a sign of that healing that you're talking about. It's like developing the trust in the Lord, right? Because there's a few things that we have to do, and one of those is making some sacrifices, making some changes, being willing to admit that maybe we don't have it all figured out. Maybe some scholar doesn't have it all figured out. Maybe one prophet doesn't have it all figured out, but collectively we've been given these like tools and resources. And yeah, I feel like we could probably keep talking about this for a long time. Do you guys have like any one-liner thoughts? Is there any last minute thoughts that you want to share? You've got like maybe 1 minute. Are you good?
To be learned is good if you hearken to the counsels of God.
I like that one. That's a good ending.
Thanks for having
To
me
be
on.
learned is good.
Mm.
Okay, well, everybody, leave us some comments. Let us know your thoughts about who do you trust and why do you trust them? And what is your approach to discernment? How do you sift through all the voices, all the things, and come to an understanding and a trust with the Lord? Let us know. And if you have questions for any of these guys, leave the question in the comments, and hopefully we can all respond. Okay, see ya. Bye.